So my work is on tourism. I did a lot of work on tourism, but I'm also interested in mobility studies, because in the social sciences there has been what is called a mobilities turn for the last 10 years, 15 years now, where mobility is more and more perceived as a key concept, a key category in order to understand what's going on in society, in the city. And this has fostered very, very important strands of research which benefits from this new perspective. And mobility studies now brings together several once separated domains, for example, demography, transport studies, migration studies, and tourism studies. All these four issues are now being, let's say, discussed within a broader framework called mobility studies. It has become a new field of research. And that's why, in my opinion, also what's at stake with what's called overtourism or tourism issues in the city is more about mobilities than tourism strictly defined. Because it's not only about tourists, it's about many, many people moving around, going to the cities for various purposes, and not only a very strictly defined tourism purpose. And that's why I try to broaden a little bit the issue. So let's just begin with some pictures of ordinary European cities. You find here on the left side Paris with the Sacré-Cœur. Always crowded with people. Here you find Florence in Italy, always crowded with people. And here you find Assisi, also in Italy, always crowded with people. So there are now an ordinary picture, an ordinary image of cities in Europe. And we can maybe first ask, why is that so? Why the city has become an important place for tourism? It has not always been like that, and I will try to explain that a little bit later. And so this is now an issue we have to work with. So there's a category called overtourism, which is coined as a growth issue. For example, scholars say the excessive growth of visitors leading to overcrowding in areas where residents suffer the consequences of temporary and seasonal tourism peaks, which have enforced permanent changes to their lifestyles, access to amenities, and general well-being. So it's seen this growth of tourism, this over-tourism is seen as excessive. And this reminds us already of discussion in the 1970s, where there's a very important notion being discussed called carrying capacity. People thinking that places are overcrowded. And this is one of the ways today the issue of overtourism is crowded as overcrowding in areas so that people who live there, the inhabitants, suffer consequences in their daily life. This sometimes also called the touristification of everyday life. So because of the spaces of the everyday life are touristified, and this bears problems. Another way of framing is a number issue. I cite the problems associated with overcrowding can vary from alienated local residents to overloaded infrastructure. The issues can affect both established and emerging destinations of all kinds. Countries, regions, cities, and individual sites such as parks, beaches, and museums may all be affected. So this is interesting because it's a question of numbers. So, and this is a very issue I will try to get a little bit deeper into later, the question of numbers. Because if you say there's too much tourism or too many tourists, you have to establish numbers. And this is very, very difficult in practice to do that. And I will show you a little bit later why is it that difficult. And the other element which is interesting here is the different scales that are involved. So they're talking about countries, regions, cities, but also places, specific tourist places like parks, etc. And this is also an important point because often in the city, it's not the whole city which is overcrowded. In fact, there are some specific hot spots which are, let's say, overcrowded, and others are not. So this is also very interesting for the, let's say, correct framing of the issue, to not to say, okay, it's the whole city or the whole country is overcrowded. In France, they had the same problem because France, it's, let's say, one of the leading countries of tourism. Now there are 89 million of tourist arrivals last year. So from time to time, there's the question, is there not too much tourism in France? But when people then begin to say, oh no, it's not too much because, in fact, France is a very big country, etc. So, but this issue of scale is, in my opinion, a very important point. And then let's say, cohabitation issue. I will use this word later on also, because it's not only about tourists being present in the public space, but it's also about tensions on the housing market, for example, through Airbnb. I don't know if you have the same thing here in Japan, and I will later show you some figures of selected cities in Europe. This in specific cities leads to tension on the housing market. And this is a quite important issue. It's also a question of gentrification, the fact of the crowding out of popular working class neighborhoods, the changing structure of commerce also. Everyday commerce is being replaced by tourist trades, what I called the touristification of the everyday life. This is exactly that you can't buy your bread or whatever. There are only other types of commerces. But also nuisance in public space, for example, it's allowed the drug use, etc. For example, in Barcelona or in Berlin, that's really the issue. So we can maybe identify these three elements, and then come later to the question of why is this problem apparent now. And there are resistance now in European cities. These are examples from Barcelona, where there's which shows quite well this touristification of the everyday life, because it's a market. I like the fish market in Tokyo, but it's an everyday market, but now it's crowded with tourists. So people don't know how to manage that. And it's always a two-sided sword, let's say. It's interesting for the market to have also people from outside to buy things, but then sometimes it's too crowded, so people from the neighborhood don't go there any longer because it's too touristy. So it's always a two-sided sword, and I think this shows that tourism it's always very ambiguous. Right? It's not a straightforward problem. So we have to think about that in an ambiguous way also, to say, okay, on the one hand it's this, but on the other hand it's that. I had a first thesis about tourism and urban theory. Maybe I won't go into that very, very long, but just maybe to mention that until now, urban theory wasn't really interested in tourism. You find very, very few texts where tourism is problematized in urban studies and in urban theory. Conversely, tourism studies just was aware that, well, there were cities, but their tourism theory had always an anti-urban bias also, meaning that there's a famous text from a German essayist called Hans Magnus Enzensberger. He called a text in 1958, he called it A Theory of Tourism, quite famous text. And here he said, well, what is tourism? Tourism is when you leave the city. So when you leave the city for the countryside or for the beaches, etc. And this idea of to go from the overcrowded city to a beautiful countryside or beaches, this has been very deep, let's say, integrated in tourism theory. But nowadays we can ask, well, is it really true? Because now metropolises and cities have become a major tourist spots. So this idea of leaving the cities for the countryside or for the beaches or for the mountains is not longer true. So what's interesting is that tourism, what's tourism about? It's leaving the city for other cities. And there might be also a paradox, because we leave the congestion of the daily life for another congestion in the non-daily life, let's say. So there might be a paradox, and I like to think about it as a productive element in order to rethink the question of tourism in the light of this urbanizations also. So, but I won't go deeply into that, just in order to understand that nowadays there's a new link possible between tourism theory and urban theory, and which is maybe exemplified by a nice quote I found in a text by two German scholars who worked about Berlin and the ongoing touristification of Berlin, and they call it a new urban tourism. New urban tourism, because there are now effects of tourism on urban neighborhoods that will be difficult to distinguish from general processes of urban change and commodification. So tourism is now intertwined within general urban processes. And this is quite new phenomenon, because before tourism was only present on specific spots that has not been pervasively diffused in the city. And Berlin is a case where tourism has been diffusing in former residential neighborhoods. So it's an urban issue now. It's an issue of urban development, which has not been the case before. And that's why there's also this chance of two parallel investigations, tourism on the one hand and the urban on the other hand, who could finally meet. And I think this is a real, let's say, challenge, scientific challenge. I've got a second point. As the controversies in the European cities as an expression of the resistance against the touristification of neighborhoods and the touristification of the everyday life. But the statistical arguments of overtourism are difficult to objectify. That means that overtourism can be seen as a resistance first, and not as a statistical problem. And because it's very, because it is an ambiguous element, there are cities in Europe who are still pro-growth, in favor of the growth of tourism. I've surveyed many cities, and some are in favor of tourism. For example, in Paris, they say, we don't have a problem of over-tourism. We need to do more tourism. Or in other cities like Cambridge. And then others are against tourism, for example, Barcelona. And I have some examples later. And also, the World Tourism Organization is in favor of urban tourism. Right? They say, for example, tourism is a key resource for cities and local residents. the future development of cities will demand policies that take into account cities' economic, social, and environmental stability, while at the same time offering the best experience for visitors. Tourism needs the diverse and flexible products a city can offer, and cities need tourism to achieve their social and economic objectives. So this is a vision of tourism for cities which is in favor of continuing growth. So it's not, I want to say, to quote that in order to say that there are stakeholders which are in favor of the further development of tourism. And then there are stakeholders against the development of tourism. And still we can ask, why has this developed that far? And I will offer some figures later. But what we have experienced in Europe is a de-industrialization of cities. And so we can see tourism as a replacement of manufacturing industries. And so even traditional manufacturing cities like Glasgow, Liverpool, the Ruhr in Germany, Essen, for example, or other cities, Bilbao, everybody knows Bilbao for the Guggenheim. So these are all examples which have been, and I did that on purpose, all examples of cities that have been cultural capital of Europe, which is a European scheme where you can bid for being a cultural capital for 1 year. And all those formerly industrial cities have been transformed into cultural and tourism cities. And so there lies also an element that explains why today tourism has been has been successful and is that present in contemporary or European cities. So there's a politics and policies in favor of tourism for the last at least 30 years. And that's why we are in this situation today. And so there's resistance against tourism now. This is an example from Barcelona. So you see the quote: "This isn't tourism; it's an invasion." So and this is very interesting because it's not about tourism per se, but it's a specific form of tourism. So it's not tourism per se is not rejected, but it's a certain form of tourism, especially in Barcelona, where, for example, cruise ships arrive with 3,000 people just flocking into the city. This is one problem in Barcelona, and the other being Airbnb, which replaces a traditional neighborhood. So this touristification of the everyday life. So there's resistance, and in Barcelona, for example, there has been a huge political change, and the actual mayor of Barcelona put into works new policies against tourism in general, against new hotel projects, and against Airbnb. So these are the measures that are taken. Another is also Barcelona. Welcome tourists. The rent of holiday apartments in this neighborhood destroys the local socio-cultural fabric and promotes speculation. Many local residents are forced to move out. Enjoy your stay. This is also an ironic statement in order to say, okay, this is exactly the question of Airbnb, where the rents are much higher now than before because of this the possibility of Airbnb, which is much more profitable to rent. And so they address this issue, and then Barcelona, good for the tourists, bad for the neighborhoods. So the coach, the tourist buses that go all over the city. So these are two aspects that are addressed. These are examples from Berlin. Berlin doesn't love you. You know all this New York slogan from the 70s. I love New York. With a heart. And here it's also an ironic feature. Berlin doesn't love you. So, and then another thing, welcome to Berlin, now go home. So anti-tourista, so many elements where there's where movements exist now against tourism. So this shows that tourism is not a neutral or only an economic problem. It's also a social and cultural question, and so there's a political problem. So there's a resistance now against tourism. Last example from Lucerne. It's a very small city in Switzerland, and now there's one event of reclaiming the streets. I don't know, you know maybe the expression "reclaim the streets," which is used in neighborhoods in order to say, okay, we want our streets back, for example, against cars or other types of occupation. And here, the inhabitants of Lucerne reclaim the streets from tourists, because they say, okay, there are too much tourists in the city. Now we have also to reclaim our public space back. And maybe this is also an interesting point. It's also about public space. And the problem here is that you can't do much because public space is public. And I will make this argument later also when I will say that tourism is also a quest for centrality in the public space of the city. Well, it's public space, so the regulation of this public space is maybe an issue, but it's not very easily done. As I said, tourism is not a neutral category. It's a statistical, moral, legal, economic, political, and scientific category, which can be used for different political goals. And this is also an important point, because especially the statistical argument is very difficult to sustain, especially because of the shortcoming of the statistical apparatus. For example, counting the Airbnb listings, it's very, very difficult. You can't really, you have a specific overview about the overall rentals, and but not much more. And this is an issue for cities who try to regulate Airbnb. Here's an example from Berlin. In fact, there has been various legal attempts for the last 5 years now to regulate Airbnb, sometimes with success, sometimes not. Here you see that there was a ban coming into effect in 2016, and you see the effect on the numbers of Airbnb. Nowadays, we're again at the 20,000 threshold in Berlin. So now the question is this much or is it not much? 20,000 apartments listed on Airbnb. There are 2 million dwellings in Berlin, so it would be 1%. So you could say, oh, it's nothing, it's not much. Again, it's a question of scale. For the whole city of Berlin, it might be not much, but in some neighborhoods, it's much more. So you have to. The judgment is not very easy to make with these figures. In Barcelona, it's the same thing. The attempt to quantify Airbnb or tourist numbers are very, very difficult to do. The problem also is the question of statistics. I just want to say a little bit more about the statistical problems, because when you try to do it in a comparative perspective, it's very difficult to compare different figures, because in different countries there are different statistical methodologies. On the nation-state level, there's an attempt to standardize it on the global level. So in theory, every country should do it in the same way. But in practice, it's not the case. So already on the nation-state level, you can't really rely on the statistics. So, for example, if France says, I'm very sorry about that it's the first, France is the first the tourism country in the world with 89 million of tourist arrivals, we don't know really if this figure is robust, if we can rely on it, because it's an extrapolation of a survey done with 80,000 people coming into France, and then from this figure they try to elaborate something. In other countries it's different. For example, in Switzerland, they rely on hotel figures because hotel owners are required by law to give the figures to the municipality, and the municipality gives it to the canton, the regional state, and the canton gives it to the federal state. So there's a knowledge on bad nights, but well, what do bad nights mean when it comes to tourism? Everything is not about bad nights. So in every country there are shortcomings and problems, so you can't really rely on tourism figures. And this is a real problem when it comes to tourism. I also brought some elements for Berlin, for example. You just what's maybe important, the exact figures are maybe not important. It's the proportion which is important. It tripled in the last 25 years. And this has been the case also for other big destinations like Amsterdam, who now say, no, we don't do any marketing efforts any longer. We have already too much people there, so we don't do marketing any longer. Our marketing has been too successful. So they stopped now doing marketing. And very interesting numbers I found for Tokyo. It's very interesting because it also illustrates the difficulty of using adequate categories for tourism. For example, here you see three things. You see the overall growth of Japan. Inbound visitors to Japan, meaning coming from overseas. Okay, so now at the 30 million mark, compared with earlier statistics, is really a big growth. You see the same thing, inbound visitors, so overseas visitors to Tokyo, very important also. But then you have a quite weird category, domestic visitors. And if you take this figure seriously, you are over 500 million people. 500 million people coming to Tokyo every year. I looked at the methodology. It's very interesting because it relies on surveys done on tourist spots. Very interesting. But and so they interviewed foreign tourists, Japanese tourists, and also people from Tokyo. And so this is a tricky thing to say that people from Tokyo are tourists in their own city. It might work if you use a very, very broad category of tourists, saying that, okay, everybody's a tourist everywhere. But then the category of tourist lacks, let's say, sharpness, and I think it's not very useful to do it. But if you say we have 500 million mobile people, that's why in the beginning I said maybe we should move more into mobility studies than into, let's say, from tourism studies in a strict sense to mobility studies. Then, for leisure purposes, they are mobile within Tokyo. Then that makes sense. But then you say it's not only over tourism, but it's, let's say, over mobility or over leisure, let's say. And this changed a little bit the way we conceive of tourists, because we always conceive of tourists as the other, people who are very different from us. But in fact, everybody is a tourist, but not at the same time. But people from Barcelona coming to Berlin, and the week after, people from Berlin go to Barcelona. So people are always on the move, and this is an important point. And I think that makes this figure very, very interesting if you look at it like let's say leisure mobilities in a very broad sense. And then it makes sense, and then it also might help us also not to focus only on tourists in a very strict sense as foreigners or as people from the outskirts or from other places, but we put into the pictures all the people that are mobile within the city, and I think that would help. So, in order to go a little further into this argument that people are mobile, and maybe it's not the specific issue of over-tourism, but as, let's say, over-mobility that can be addressed. Maybe we have to move a little bit further and say that tourists are also inhabitants of the city. Tourists, that's why my thesis, tourists inhabit the city touristically and are temporary inhabitants. A symmetrical approach to inhabiting is needed in order to unpack the binary dichotomy at the very, very heart of the current controversies about tourism in contemporary European cities. Because what we experience that there's this opposition, this dichotomy between the locals and the tourists, between the inhabitants on the one hand and the tourists on the other hand. But I think that in contemporary societies where people adopted a mobile lifestyle, where the lifestyle is very, very much informed by mobility, it is questionable if this opposition is very continues makes sense. As my example showed, in 1 week people from Barcelona come to Berlin, and the next week it's the other way around. So, who is the tourist? Who is the inhabitant? I think it becomes in the very situation. It's very clear. Okay, I reside in a city, and then I go to another city. But in fact, it's about mobility, and that's why in my work I try to frame the tourists symmetrically to the residents. Let's say also as an inhabitant, but not with the same competences, with the same way of inhabiting the city. That's why I use this expression to inhabit the city touristically, in a touristic fashion, in a touristic way, and not for sure as a resident. And this comes, in fact, from a German poet, Hölderlin, who says, dichterisch wohnet der Mensch auf dieser Erde, poetically man dwells on the earth. So, and you can simply transform it in saying that today maybe man inhabits, or men and women, because, well, in his time he didn't really make the distinction. Today we dwell touristically the earth, because we develop a tourist gaze for everything all over the world, and so the specific way of practicing the city is at stake, and this specific way of inhabiting is informed by a tourist gaze, by the way we engage with the city touristically. We see the city as tourists. We see the city as only as attraction, as tourist attraction. We don't see it in another way. And so this is the specific way people inhabit the city. And that's also why there are those controversies, because it's about having fun, about pleasure. And so this conflicts with other ways of inhabiting the city. This is very important in order to understand that there's this mobility issue, meaning that we have to go further than the only question of tourism. And it also implies that we don't look only on the touristic practices, but we try to understand that tourist practices are only one element of a larger system of mobilities people develop. So that's just one tiny little bit of many, many mobilities. And I think the Tokyo figure makes that clear also, because people are mobile and they are always also touristically mobile, but not only. They also are mobile for their work, for leisure, for study reasons, etc., etc., etc. So mobility is everywhere, and so tourism is only let's say, a specific element of this overall mobility. But coming back to my thesis, I think it would help not to see the tourist as a stranger, but as a inhabitant of the city with different competences. So I will come to my last element about the question of if we say the tourists also inhabit the city, then there is the issue of co-inhabiting with the residents and with all the people that are present in the city. And so this is a conflictual situation, and we have to accept it as a conflict. So this co-inhabiting. And that's why I like very much to approach the city as an inhabited space not only by the residents, but by all the people that come through. And this is an important element because it shows also the issue of co-inhabiting and of this the city as inhabited space. And I would like to refer to Henri Lefebvre, a French sociologist and philosopher of the urban, who said something about the city like that, I quote, "Urban life suggests meetings, the confrontation of differences, reciprocal knowledge and acknowledgement, including ideological and political confrontations, and ways of living patterns which coexist in the city." The city, if you ask for a definition of the city, that's it. It's about co-inhabiting people from very different backgrounds, conflict about their different projects in the city. But then we have also to put the question of tourism into it nowadays, which wasn't maybe that a problem when he wrote now 50 years ago. And that's why I think that tourism can be seen as exercising the right to centrality. Public space, although the essential place of urbanity, becomes one of the contested spaces against tourism. Because that comes back to the question of the beginning, why tourists go to the metropolises and the cities nowadays. And one element I would like to defend here is to say that it's about exercising the right to centrality, because people don't reside in the city centers any longer, but in the outskirts. So tourism is one way, one means to practicing the very city center. And so this is and in my opinion, this is also where the conflict comes from, because there's a conflict around centrality, the very central places within the city, and so especially the public space becomes a place of becomes a contested space. And this is very interesting because there are social movements in Europe who claim a right to the city, a right to centrality. But these are, let's say, grassroots movements, say not only, let's say, a commercial use of the city is very important, but also, let's say, a more a shared view of the space. And these grassroots movements conflict with the tourists' right to centrality, if you want. There are two different rights to centrality that are exercised. And so these are very important issues nowadays. And if we want to understand why these issues are very urgent now, it's because there are also the social movements who claim a right to the city, a reappropriation of city space by the residents, by the inhabitants, and tourism is one of the conflictual elements, but it's not the only one. There are also other issues and other confrontations and other controversies in European cities, which all, I would say, are related to the question of the appropriation of urban space by inhabitants. So what Henri Lefebvre called the right to the city or the right to centrality. But I claim that it's not only a right for the inhabitants, but it's also a right that is claimed by the tourists, and that's why it's a very conflicted element. Especially because it's about public space, it's very difficult to regulate and to overcome. And there are some attempts in European cities, for example, to limit the access to the city, which is feasible in some spots, but it's not a policy which works in all the cities. And I will just finish here in saying that we have to be mindful that it's a contested overtourism. Well, tourism is a contested element. Some people are in favor of continued growth of tourism, and others, in the light of this congestion issue, are against it. So tourism is not a neutral category, but it is a political and contested arena, let's say, and that's why I turned my speech today around the controversies, so about the conflicts, because people have then the opportunity to express different views and also different political struggles around tourism. Thank you very much.